So the digestive system does the same for our body. It allows us to digest and absorb. It produces nutrients itself. It contributes to hormone production, brain chemistry signaling. It is a main contributor to immune function. It also helps us to regulate stress hormones and detoxification. So it really is kind of the center, right, of where everything begins. And they go to the coffee in the plastic lids, right? When they drink that, I mean, they've been able to show that just from that, there's like a 400% increase in the amount of plastic exposure just from sipping off of these plastic lids.
Functional medicine doctor helping people with autoimmunity and longevity. Our guest today on the Settle or Be Better podcast is Dr. Daniel Gonzalez, who's going to be talking to us about gut health, hormones, and a lot more. So welcome, Dr. Daniel, and over to you. Why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about your personal health and well-being story and your current work?
My personal health and well-being, well, gosh, I was raised in a standard American household, and that includes the standard American diet. So growing up, I was definitely exposed, to fast food. I would say that was the vast majority of my diet growing up. McDonald's and Burger King and all the fast food chains. Microwave food, that was the easiest thing for my mother to cook for me. Also raised in a conventional medical setting, so just like we see it happening today, it's really no different. You get sick, you go to the doctor, they give you a prescription. That was my worldview growing up. I'd always had an interest in science. Along the way, as I started to get older, I'm so fortunate because I had the foresight to be able to take matters into my own hands. And as a teenager, even, I started to understand principles of true health. Eating well, like thinking, okay, fast food is not the best thing for my body. I grew up on a ranch, and there's a lot that you can learn from the land, working the land and things like that on a ranch, and the concepts of nature and the cycles of things as they happen and the way that life happens on a land like that. I think that also helps to give me some kind of insight in terms of the nature of things. Coming from that place as a teenager, started to learn more concepts about what health really was. That kind of led me into having curiosity and wanting to learn more. And so that led me into, me and my studies in school and eventually becoming a functional medicine practitioner. And I kind of came full circle. It wasn't until I was a full adult to where I had autonomy in terms of taking care of myself and buying my own food and learning all the things that I needed to learn to take care of myself. But I've seen both sides, right? I know what it's like to come from that life. Where I am today, even though I'm older, I'm definitely way healthier and so much better in terms of my health and how I function than when I was 20, than for sure when I was 15. I mean, I was overweight. I used to, it was crazy thinking back.
Amazing. That's an interesting story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I can't wait to dive deep into our episode today. You talk about so many important things on your page, through your channel, and throughout your videos and information that you share. So there's so much to learn from this episode today. And to begin with, since we're going to focus on gut health and hormone health today, begin with, what is your take on longevity and gut health? I mean, of course, now we all know that we should definitely avoid junk food. We know what to avoid, more or less, right? Like in a nutshell. But what is your take? Because today, considering nutrition, there's so many food wars out there. I mean, right. One would say go carnivore, one would say go vegan. They'd say, have the best of both worlds or have something in moderation. What is your take on gut health, and what have you seen work best as a functional medicine doctor?
When we think about the digestive system, it's fascinating, obviously. I mean, all the systems are important. Your nervous system, your cardiovascular system, your detoxification, your digestive system, as we're going to talk about, your hormones. I like to look at the digestive system, akin to fertile soil of the earth, which of course is fundamental to life. There's dirt is dead, and then there's soil, which is living. And just as the soil of our planet nourishes life because of the mycelium, all the fungus and organisms and all the nutrients that's inside of it, that provides nutrients in communication with other life forms. It's how we harness energy from the sun, obviously, and through plants. And then it kind of initiates that whole system. So the digestive system does the same for our body. It allows us to digest and absorb. It produces nutrients itself. It contributes to hormone production, brain chemistry signaling. It is a main contributor to immune function. It also helps us to regulate stress hormones and detoxification. So it really is kind of the center, right, of where everything begins. And so when we talk about, and so much so that the science behind it, you can look at the interconnection of all the systems. There's a gut to brain axis. There's a gut to skin, gut to heart, gut to liver, gut to hormones because of that, right? Because this is the central repository of where everything's happening. So if somebody really understands that, they understand how important and interconnected the digestive system is, then we can begin to have conversations about how our diet can influence that, right? And drive that. And as you said, there's the low-hanging fruit or the basics. Just like soil, you don't want to spray it with herbicides and pesticides and all sorts of chemicals because you're going to kill it. Well, the same with your gut. You don't want to kill your digestive system, right? So you don't want to be spraying it or exposing it to herbicides herbicides, pesticides, antibiotics. People, especially in this country, consume over-the-counter medications, Tylenol, aspirin, ibuprofen, Pepto-Bismol, all these chemicals that we put into our body that we're taking it for a reason, but it's killing off the soil that is our digestive tract, of course, contributes to dysfunction. But when we talk about the diet, and as you alluded to, there's all these different types of diets that are sexy: carnivore, plant-based, keto. You have all these diets. And I think it's helpful for somebody to have a template. And there certainly is a time and a place where I would prescribe a specific type of diet because it is a foundation for somebody to follow. But truth be told, if I was in a room full of, 1,000 people, just what are the fundamentals? What are the basics? Whole foods, right? So is the food that you're putting into your body where does it come from? Is it coming from a healthy source? Whether that's plants or animals. Was the soil healthy? Was that treated right? Was that animal healthy? Was that animal treated right? Minimally processed, meaning you can take these whole foods and try to not convert them, change them, adulterate them, to make them different. And then of course there's consumption, which of course you can eat too much of a certain thing, but the reality is if you're eating whole foods, it's kind of hard to eat a whole lot. If you're eating healthy, it's easy to eat the processed, refined stuff, right? So it's really not hard. We have so much noise in our environment. You have so many things coming at you, people telling you, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and so we lose sight of just what the basics are. What is normal, which again is just eating whole foods, make sure it's free from chemicals, unadulterated, minimally processed. That's the starting point. And then of course, depending on the individual and where they are, there are some people that are, I don't want to say too far gone, but they've created a dysfunction to where now they probably have to be on a certain type of diet for a while to get them out of that back into a healthy place. So it kind of depends ultimately on where you are.
Understood. That was really well explained. It definitely eases it down for us. Thank you for sharing that with us. And like you beautifully explained in the beginning, that how different systems of a body affect our digestive system, right? So when we say gut health, the first thing that comes to our mind is a diet, that it's just what we are eating. But apart from nutrition specifically, because again it can be very individualistic to the person, their health history and everything, apart from nutrition, what would be, say, the 5 things, if you have to say that this will definitely affect your gut health, and if you want to improve your gut health, these are the 5 things you would want to look into considering your lifestyle? So what would be those 5 things according to you?
5 things that could affect our gut health. Well, chemical exposure. So that, and we now today in this environment, it's hard for anybody to not hear this now in the news, but plastics, right? The amount of, we're finding now all the latest studies. Even, every week there's a new study that comes out. Plastics everywhere inside of our body, in our brain, plaques of our arteries, where, we have over the last few decades created this lifestyle where a lot of even our food, even healthy food, organic food packaged in plastic, healthy takeout food, or how we store our food, the exposure to some of these plastics, these phthalates, BPA, all these chemicals that we've allowed, unfortunately, into our environment, which just within the last 2 years have become, where we're now acknowledging their problems with them. Limiting your exposure, I think that would be number 1, is just the exposure to these chemicals and how you're storing your food and what you're allowing to come in. Something as simple, think of how many people drink coffee and they go to the coffee in the plastic lids, right? When they drink that, they've been able to show that just from that, there's like a 400% increase in the amount of plastic exposure just from sipping off of these plastic lids. That's one thing. I would say number 2, and I can't speak for every country, but definitely here in the United States, the overutilization of prescription drugs. Almost every prescription drug, almost every one, is going to negatively affect your microbiome. And you can just look up studies on this. You can search any drug and you're going to find that it's going to have a negative influence on your microbiome. Of course, the irony there is that if you're healthy and taking care of yourself, you don't need the prescription drug. Once you get on the prescription drug, it's like a vicious cycle where now it's creating further disruption. And yet you're trying to heal, but it's hard to heal if you can't heal your gut. Again, number 1 would be chemical exposure, and then environmental chemical exposure. And then again, prescription drugs would be another one. I would say part of that too, we need to include alcohol. Most people don't realize this, but 1 drink of alcohol, just a single drink, can induce a state of leaky gut for up to 2 weeks, which is pretty interesting, right? And so for people that drink regularly, and even though they say, I just have 1 drink, 1 glass of wine, it's not a big deal, but you're actually contributing to, this state of dysfunction within your body. So that needs to be part of those, chemical exposure. Number 3, chronic stress. That is a big one. Chronically elevated cortisol has been shown to contribute to leaky gut. Also elevates inflammation. And then again, that creates this whole cascade, right, of where we're running into problems. Sleep is actually something that most people don't think about, but it does influence your microbiome. Our digestive tract actually has its own circadian rhythm. You tend to think like, okay, I've got a biological cycle. We have lots of cycles. And just like you have to be going to bed and waking up at the same time to have to be in a good rhythm for your circadian rhythm, your digestive tract has its own circadian rhythm. And so when you have disruption of sleep, it actually creates disruption disruption within that digestive circadian rhythm cycle. Exercise is another. I'm trying to think of things that people don't think about typically for the gut. Exercise just in itself. I'm going to say if you're not exercising at a minimum 3 days a week, at a minimum, I guarantee you're creating dysbiosis because exercise has been shown to help improve diversity within our microbiome. Usually we think of supplements and food and all that kind of stuff, but just exercise itself has been shown to, help influence that. So those are some of the main things that I would share with somebody that doesn't think about too much with their gut, aside from food.
Amazing. These are some great points, especially about prescription medication as well, because in India, we've become so comfortable with antibiotics, unfortunately, that it's like every household would have it, and even our grandparents or parents would know which one to have, especially if we are having a viral or a lot of cold and cough for seasonal reasons or anything. The first thing that our grandparents would also, at their time, they did not even have these medications. They were not so familiar with it. But now it's become so comfortable in the family that if you have a sore throat or something, or even if you feel like it's going to happen and you're going to fall sick for the next 5 days, that's the first thing they will pop out. Here, take the antibiotics. It's become so comfortable with it. And sometimes, because I've seen with me also, and with my close ones, say last year for a few months, everybody was going through this allergy, or they were just not being able to recover through this cold for the longest time, in winter, it was for 2 to 3 months, and it just kept going in and out. And people must have taken at least 2 or 3 cycles of antibiotics in 2 months because they're just so comfortable with it, right? That's the harsh truth today. So that is one thing that I've noticed a lot happening here within just families, friends and all, right? So that's something we definitely need to be more careful about, is even if you go to your family doctor, a regular conventional medication, that's what they will give you. They will put you on that kind of medication because that's what they taught. So this definitely sheds a lot of light on this. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Talking about hormone health, I've seen friends as young as in their early 20s, women having so many hormonal issues today, like PCOS, thyroid, many more. But is it possible to work on these issues without turning to medication if you are in, say, your 20s or in your early ages? Is it possible to have an impact on these hormonal issues with women specifically?
It's absolutely possible. It also just depends, right? It depends on the individual, how long they've had the problem, and what exactly the problem is. And this is why I love functional medicine, because you're asking why. What is the dysfunction within the body that is contributing to this? And then you begin the process of investigating and uncovering, that to understand what's going on. And when we talk about hormone imbalances, our hormones don't just become imbalanced, right? Just for the heck of it. There's got to be a reason. And there's many reasons, again, in our current environment that are driving that. What's interesting is when you look at studies that are done on modern day hunter-gatherers, so people that still live as though we lived way back, our ancestors, right? Thousands of years. And you'll find that they don't have nearly anywhere close to the level of conditions that we suffer from in a modern society. Excess estrogen or estrogen deficiencies or testosterone deficiencies, thyroid imbalances, all these things that we can talk about with hormones, they're not experiencing them to the extent that we do. Now, there's a small percentage that, yes, there can be dysfunctions that happen, but it is a very small percentage. So, to answer your question, you say, is it possible? It's possible, but is it also possible that they truly have a problem, a mechanism that's just broken, and they need to have hormones? Absolutely. But you should first figure out where you are on that timeline, because if you can correct it without that, well, obviously that should be the first step, right? We shouldn't just jump straight to the hormone model today. Is if you have low estrogen, let's give you hormone to top it off. If you have low testosterone, let's give you hormone to top it off. That's hormone replacement. That's the model. What we should be thinking about is hormone optimization. So what are all the factors that go into creating hormones, for our body? And is there anything there that is missing? There could be nutritional deficiencies, which many people have, something like omega-3 fatty acids. That's a very common one. If you don't have healthy levels of omega-3 fats, you're not going to be able to produce and utilize hormones regardless, even if you're taking it, as a replacement. So there's nutritional deficiencies, your digestive tract, as we're talking about, which is responsible for producing over 50 different hormones that help to regulate all sorts of things. So you got to think about all the different steps of what's happening there. And then you just try to correct as many of those steps. And there's had many times in my own practice where a patient could be deficient in hormones or have hormone imbalance, correct those deficits, their body thrives, their body's to work by itself just through diet and lifestyle changes. Then there's a hybrid. Sometimes, you do that, you correct some hormones, but they're still not exactly where they need to be. Okay, right. Maybe because of autoimmunity, or maybe because of, there's damage elsewhere. So then you can begin the process of using supplements or herbs to try to support that. And if that doesn't work, well, then you move on to, there's peptides now that are very effective, at helping hormones. And then if not, there's hormone replacement, I would say, as a last alternative, but we start there most often rather than looking at all this ground groundwork that we need to do firsthand.
That definitely happens in the biohacking world a lot. Like, we are attracted to the very fancy new biohacks and devices out there, and we almost forget to do the simpler things in life that can have a major impact on our life. So that was really interesting. And also, when there are women who might have regular menstrual cycles, but they might be very tough on them, like it's very painful, and over the years, right? I mean, of course, there are major issues like endometriosis, if I'm not wrong, but if they are not been diagnosed with anything like that, but they just have really tough periods, like something painful, or it's at least for the first 2-3 days not being able to do much, what do you think can be done to help them with?
Gosh, well, again, every case is going to be unique and different, and it kind of depends on the workup, right, of that individual and what's happening. As far as things that we can do to improve gut health, first of all, let me just say this too. I think it's important to acknowledge that we have not, as a society or scientifically speaking, been studying hormones appropriately in women as we should have been, right? So for too long, and for many years, you only had men that were unfortunately doing this. And to a man, questions that a man asks about the menstrual cycle is going to be very different, obviously, from a woman.
Right.
I mean, so there's inherent problems in what we know in the data that we have, just because of how it's turned out historically. Fortunately, now that's starting to change, and we're starting to pay attention more to what is normal. What's a normal menstrual cycle on, days of bleed and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's very important to be able to then determine how to functionally correct. Because if you don't know how it's working to begin with, well, we're kind of at a loss. But if you were to look at data right now in terms of what are the things that we can do to help someone, actually, I'll share something very, I'm going to say simple, but it's not for most women. 30-33. 30 grams of protein, 30 grams of fiber, 3 days of strength training. As simple as that seems, it's not easy for people to hit that, but 30 grams of protein per meal, 30 grams of fiber per day, 3 days of strength training per week. I can almost guarantee you the vast majority of people that are having some hormone imbalances, health issues, if they optimize their protein intake, if they increase their fiber the way that they need to, and they start strength training, building muscle, we forget that muscle is a very powerful endocrine organ. It actually helps to regulate hormones as well. Some of the best medicine that we can give ourselves is just working out and building muscle. But those would be 3 things that you could incorporate for anybody that's having menstrual irregularity, heavy menses, missed periods, painful periods. Increase your protein intake, increase your fiber intake, 3 days of strength training. That's, again, a simple prescription. That's a challenge. I would have anybody do that. Give yourself time, 3 months. So that's the other 3, 33. 3 months, give yourself some time before you say it's not working. But aside from that, like we're talking about, eat whole foods, of course, avoid processed, refined foods, reduce your exposure to plastics, phthalates, BPA. For women especially, this is very important. Most of the cosmetic products that we use are not properly vetted. A lot of companies are not obligated to disclose all the things that they put inside of them. And unfortunately, there's a lot of endocrine disruptors. There's compounds in these skincare products and creams and shampoos that could be the culprit, right, or contributing to part of the problem. So try to reduce your exposure to that stuff. Then you can talk about gut health supports, such as prebiotics and probiotics. Now, of course, there's supplementation, but we should first have the conversation of how do you get that through food. Prebiotics are basically fibers, soluble and insoluble. So just think of all the different types of fibers that you could be exposing yourself to. Fruits and vegetables, right? I mean, that's pretty much what that comes back to. Then there's probiotics, which is food that has cultures, good bacteria that we can consume. Fermented foods, kimchi, sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, yogurts, kombucha, right? There's a whole bunch that we can talk about there. I think also part of probiotics is that we've become so scared as a society of bugs and germs. We're too clean, let me just say. Like, we sanitized our environments to the point to where we disturb the biome. We don't have exposure to healthy bugs. And that's part of it. Like, literally, you got to play in the dirt, be in the environment. Like, go out and be in nature and expose yourself to everything that's there. Because that's part of building a healthy immune system to have a healthy gut. It's ironic when we try to get rid of these organisms, because then we become weaker because our body doesn't have any way of handling them. And so, those are some of the basics there.
Amazing. There's some great insights, and also the 3 things to remember very easily. I'm sure they're very doable also, because you've eased it down into the very basics. So thank you for sharing that. And lastly, talking about men's health and hormones, hormone regulation, because there's a lot less conversation when it comes to men's health and hormone regulation. I mean, for women, anything happens, health related, the first thing we assume is it's some hormonal imbalance. There's some hormonal imbalance. We need to work on it. And we also have the menstrual cycle to sort of indicate whether or not something is going wrong in your body, in your hormones, and you can immediately get it checked, or it's a great indicator for us. But very rarely do we hear men talk about any hormonal issues. And I mean, just maybe in their late 50s or something, you would hear the conversation about men and testosterone, but not much in the beginning, early years, right? So what are some indicators for men in their health specifically that indicate that there is some hormonal imbalance that is causing this discomfort for them, or some sort of issues in their health? And this is the area that we should look into for improving the current situation.
There's a few, and I'm going to say that this first one applies to both men and women, and I think this is important on any conversation of health: insulin resistance or blood sugar regulation. Our inability to regulate blood sugar properly. This again goes back to, of course, our physical activity, being too sedentary or not eating the right foods. We create problems for ourselves where we become insulin resistant or have even low grade. There's many times where somebody can go to their conventional doctor, they get their blood tested, their blood sugar is going to come back normal, but that's all they looked at. You're going to miss a potential dysfunction. There's several blood markers that you'd want to look at to properly evaluate somebody's blood sugar regulation. And if blood sugar is off, every single chronic health condition you can think of is going to be affected. That, especially if we're talking about hormones and testosterone. So on that conversation, what happens when we start to have insulin resistance? Well, you're not lean anymore. You can get like a little belly. You get fatigue, low energy. Your motivation starts to change. You just don't feel the urge to go and be active. Right? So those are all kind of initial symptoms that are stemming from insulin resistance. And again, it's a blood sugar, imbalance. So that needs to be assessed and looked at. The other thing would be for men, like I said, motivation. That's huge. There's so many men that I work with on this. They have low testosterone. They need to be working out. They need to get into the gym and they need to lift weights, but they don't have the motivation to be able to do that. So they're kind of caught in this cycle, right? But that lack of motivation, because that's what testosterone does. I also think that testosterone doesn't get enough attention for women, by the way. It's not just men. Many times what can seem like an estrogen issue, it's a testosterone issue in women as well. And that's important. And for her, there's going to be a difference because of our psychology and the way our brain works, but testosterone and motivation and interest and creativity for her could be off because of that. So again, those are signals that, if that's going on. Now, that's easy to also be thrown into, you're depressed. And then they go get put on an antidepressant when it's really hormone issue that's driving that, right? Not depression. Sleep. So waking up in the middle of the night frequently because your hormones are thrown off. That's a big one. And there's many. And unfortunately, that's also a slippery slope because once you're not sleeping, that also affects the way that you're producing, hormones throughout the day. So again, I would say low energy for sure, insulin resistance, motivation issues. When you can start to see centripetal obesity or weight gain around your belly, like the midsection, kind of get like a little, you're not fat necessarily, but you can see that there's fat deposition that's abnormal. That's a very strong sign of insulin resistance, but also testosterone deficiency. And so, those are things, to think about there. Somebody that's not recovering well. So if you work out and it takes you days to be able to feel good enough to go and work out again, your inability to recover is also another strong sign, of that.
Right. Amazing. We have some great indicators, and I hope that there's some more awareness around this. And we know that there is some hormonal issue that is probably, playing into this for your discomfort, and not just turn to some medication immediately to solve the problem for the moment, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. And this brings us to the end of the episode today. As we conclude, do you have any last messages or thoughts to leave us with?
I would say don't complicate things, right? If we're talking about, because all these things are very complex, and human biology, our physiology is very complex, and humans, we do a good job of creating problems. That's marketing, right? It's consumerism. Like, we do a good job of that, but it doesn't have to be that hard. You just ask yourself, how are you moving? How are you eating? How are you thinking? Am I putting good nutrients into my body? Am I getting good movement? Am I trying to manage my stress? Am I having a sense of community and connection? Really doesn't have to be that hard. And for most people, they're searching for these shiny objects. Like you were saying earlier, we're trying to find something when the answers are really just in those basics there. And if we master those basics, there's a whole lot of amazing things that are going to happen just naturally because that's how we're designed.
Amazing. That was a beautiful message. Thank you so much for being here today with us. And we're really glad to have you here. And for the ones that don't follow you already, there'll be links in the description below. They can reach out to you, learn a lot more from you and everything that you shared. So thank you once again for being here today.
Yes, thank you.